Hello. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for being here. My name is Pablo Gonzalez. I'm a business engineer and architect at Salto. I'm from Dublin, Ireland. And today I'm going to talk about the rise and fall of the Dependency API. So, quick agenda. First, I'm going to talk about the rise of the Dependency API. I'm going to explain some use cases. Then I'm going to talk about some of the limitations of this API. Then I'll explain how I worked on a project for 2 years called Happy Soup, and I bypassed some of the limitations of this API. And then we get to the sad part where we talk about the fall of the Dependency API. Okay, so the API started as a pilot program 4 years ago in summer 18, and it's basically an object on the tooling API that allows you to extract dependencies in metadata. Of course, I'll give a proper example of this. So it basically supports two main use cases. The typical where is this used, where you want to see where some metadata type is used in other metadata. And then what I call a deployment boundary, which is understanding all the dependencies of a specific metadata type. So this is what it looks like. Basically, it's a object called metadata component dependency, and it has two sets of fields. So what you're seeing here is a query to see all the places where a custom field is being used. So the ID that you see there at the bottom is the ID of the field. And as you can see, I'm filtering that on the ref metadata component ID. And if you see, the first section is all ref metadata, and the second section in red is just metadata component ID, metadata component name, and component type. So the idea is that the red section is going to give you the metadata that is referencing the ID on the reference.
When you're up here speaking, it's like, well, why the hell should you listen to me? Like,
So
why?
if I execute that
Anyone else
query,
other than the talks
this
inside
is
me?
what it looks like. So essentially, I'm seeing all the places where the custom field customer priority is being used. So on the left, you see the exact same thing multiple times because, as I said, that just shows that which is being referenced. So in this case, that kind of doesn't make a lot of sense because you're seeing the same thing over and over again. But if you were not to filter this query, then you would see different things on the left side. But anyway, so here you see the custom field which is being referenced, and on the right side you see what is referenced in that field. So I can see that the field is being used in 4 page layouts, 2 formula fields, 4 Apex classes, and a bunch of flows. So this is very useful to understand, again, where your metadata is used, and it supports different use cases that we're going to check later. Which is just now actually. So some dependency API use cases in the real world. The first one is Happy Soup, which I will demo in detail later. But it's basically an open source app to really understand where fields are being used. Another example is Knuckle, which is an open source language to describe the metadata of business applications. And in this case, what we're seeing is a validation rule represented in Knuckle. Because it's not XML, then we can actually add our own attributes. And so here we have these generated dependencies, which basically shows that this validation rule depends on this custom field. And that's also generated by the Dependency API. Finally, there's an open source app as well from a friend of mine in France called OrgCheck, which is really good for technical depth. And there's also a nice diagram where you can see where a field is being used in your org. So those are the basic use cases. Now, some of the limitations. If we go back to the results that I showed you earlier, there's a lot of problems if you try to use this information to build a metadata-aware product, right? So if you're trying to build something that you can then create like a package XML from, and you can retrieve the metadata or anything along those lines, there's a lot of problems. For example, the page layouts that I got here, that's not the actual full name of the layout. If you're familiar with the Metadata API, you'll know that the actual name is object dash and then the name of the page layout. The same problem we have with custom fields. Like here we have account priority, but I know that the real API name of this field should be account priority underscore C. Right? So I only get like the very raw name of the field. And again, it's not really useful if I want to use this name in subsequent calls to the Salesforce API. Another limitation, which is not really Salesforce's fault, but when you get these Apex classes here that are using that field, there's not a lot of context on how the field is being used in those classes. Are the classes reading data off of the field, or are they inserting data into that field? And that makes a whole lot of difference if you're really trying to understand how that field is used by those Apex classes. And then finally, when it comes to flows, you may not be aware that the flow metadata type also represents process builders. So what we're seeing here is a combination of process builders and flows that are used in that field, but I actually don't know which is which, right? How do I know which of these flows are actual process builders? How do I know what's the version of this? Are they active? So there's not really a lot of detail to understand what's going on here. Okay, so then those are the limitations. So let me now demo HappySoup. Just one thing to note here is that this API is also used on the where is this used button in Salesforce. So I have this custom field here, which is the one that I was showing. And if you click on where is this used, you will get this list, which has the same problems that I just described. Okay, so about 2 years ago, I started working on this open source project called HappySoup. My idea was to democratize impact analysis, make it available to everyone so that you have a free application to see where your metadata is being used. So I already logged in. I didn't want to log in live because I'm afraid that the internet will stop working or something like that. So I have everything here. But basically what I did is I selected the same custom field that I showed you earlier, and I clicked here on where is this used. And so the results are, I think, a lot nicer. So first of all, you get everything in nice folders so you can see exactly what you care about. You also get information in a table view. You can also look at a chart view. So for example, I can answer very quickly what's the metadata type that most uses this field, so I know that it's flows very quickly. I don't need to go through all the metadata and count. And there's also a field utilization tab that tells me what is the percentage of that field being populated in the org, and there is a breakdown by record type. But anyway, going back to the impact analysis of metadata, you see that we have a lot more detail here. So for example, for the Apex classes, we can see if the classes are writing data into the field or if they're reading data from the field. And again, this is very important because if you're troubleshooting something where a custom field has a value that you did not expect, you may want to understand which classes are actually inserting data into that field, right? If you have 200 classes, it's not enough to just know that these 200 classes are somehow referenced in the field. You want to know exactly how. Other improvements is we have support for workflow rules, which are not in the where is this used. There's also support for flexi pages, which was also not there. And when it comes to flows, then I can also tell you if it's a process builder, if it's actually a flow. I can tell you the actual version, and if the version is active, I can highlight that as well. So as you can see, it's just a lot more detail as to how the field is being used. Other things you can do here is you can drill down a little bit more. So for example, okay, this field is used in this Apex class, but so what? What about where the Apex class is being used? I need to understand where the class is being used so that I can understand how the field is being used as well. So in this case, the Apex class is used by a Visualforce page that has the same name, which is probably not a good example. But then I can also keep just drilling down here and say, okay, what about where that Visualforce page is being used? Okay, it's being used in a button. And what about where the button is being used? And of course, there's an end to this, which is page layouts. So great. So now I know that if I make a change to this field, I'm indirectly impacting any user who has access to this page layout because the field is used by a class that is used by a Visualforce page, which is present on the page layout. So I think this is a lot of really good insight to understand what could be the impact of making a change to this field. Okay, so let me do then a quick overview of another item here, which is the deployment boundary, which is kind of like the opposite of impact analysis, or it's the same thing, but the algorithm is just in reverse. So the idea here is that I have an Apex trigger on the lead object, And as many of you know, we have scratch orgs, which are empty orgs, right? And in the real world, I think it's very hard to work with scratch orgs because it's very hard to populate them with metadata from your org. So if you have a lead trigger and you say, okay, I want to move this trigger over to that scratch org to do some custom development, it's really, really hard because that trigger depends on 100 different things, depends on maybe 20 different Apex classes, and those classes depend on some custom fields and metadata types and a lot of different things. So it's not possible to just copy paste the trigger code from your org and into the scratch org. So what a deployment boundary does is you give it an entry point, in this case the lead trigger, and it's going to start looking at all the dependencies of every item on the dependency tree. So for example, what we're seeing here is that the lead trigger depends on one Apex class, and that Apex class depends on two other Apex classes, and this Apex class depends on two custom fields, and one of these fields then depends on another custom field because it's a controlling pick list. And so you can keep going down the dependency tree until essentially you end up with this sort of boundary of metadata that needs to exist before the top level component can exist in any org. So once you have this, you can take this out as a chunk of metadata. You can download the package XML, and then you can use this to do a metadata retrieve and then do a push to a scratch org, and it works. I've only tried it with this example, but it was pretty cool when it actually worked. So obviously this is also using the dependency API. It's not a native feature. It's me using the API recursively over and over again until I get to the last dependency. Right, okay, so this is Happy Soup, right? And one of the examples that I showed here is that we also show where custom fields are being used in flexi pages, which are lightning pages. So I have the example here of this lightning page where I have a component that has component visibility. And you can see here that that field customer priority is being used to say that this component is only shown if the customer priority of the account equals high. And that's something that is not supported by the dependency API, and it's also not in the where is this use button in Salesforce. And rather than just showing that the flex page is used in the field, I always try to go one step forward. Okay, the field is being used in the flex page, but in what way, right? Just knowing that it's being used is never enough. So here what we have is the actual filter that is being used in the component visibility where the value equals high. So this is useful because if you're changing the value high to, I don't know, highest, then you're invalidating this filter. And this applies to reports, process builder criteria, having this value hard-coded in Apex as well. So the idea of Happy Soup is to always go one step further and really understand how something is being used. Now, this example is for custom fields. So Happy Soup supports a lot of different metadata types. So you can also see where email templates are being used, or you can see where standard objects are being used across the entire org as well. Okay, so I'm gonna then do a little bit of deep dive into the code of Happy Soup, and I'm going to show how we got to this part where we can see that the field is being used in a flexi page. So Happy Soup is actually a number of packages. So the core API is an open source package called SFDC Soup. So if you're interested in that, you can use it in any project you have. Essentially, you just pass an entry point, and then you can get the usage, which is where the field is being used, or you can get a deployment boundary with get dependencies. So the API is very well documented, so you have a ton of examples on how to use this. So if you want to create a similar application to Happy Soup, or if you don't want to use Happy Soup for some reason, but you still want the functionality, then you're more than welcome to use the API. Okay, so how did we get that flexi page? How did we know that that field was being used in a flexi page? So this is the core package SFDC Soup. So essentially, I have one file per metadata type that I know needs additional, I guess, processing to get all the dependencies. So here I have this file for custom field, because I know custom fields can be used in different areas that are not supported by the API. Then I have this function here called find flex pages. And then I do a query on the flex page object using the tooling API. Now, one thing that I want to highlight here, which is very problematic, is, and I should have explained this earlier, how I know that the field is being used is by pulling the metadata object off of the flex page. So if I execute this query on the tooling API, select ID metadata from the flex page where the ID is the one that I care about, I'm going to get a big JSON object. And in that JSON object, there is a metadata object that has the actual metadata of that flex page. And then one of the objects here has the actual criteria. You can see left value is the customer priority, operator equals, and the right value high. Now, this metadata object is extremely useful, but the problem is that you cannot get it for any number of items. So you have to actually filter by an ID to get the metadata object. And that means that if I have 25 flexi pages in my org and I want to get the metadata of all of them, I can't. Or I could if I execute 25 queries to the tooling API, which is highly inefficient. And so this is one of the challenges that I had with HappySoup, and it's all over the code. I have this problem where I want to get the metadata from a metadata type to see if the field is being used there, and there's a limitation where you can only specify one at a time. So the way I solve this problem is if you take just the base result. So if I just say get me the ID of any flexi page, right? So if I go, if I go here and say, okay, it's just select ID from all the flexi pages, then that result gives me this URL, which has then the ID and like the unique ID, the unique URL to that flexi page. So it turns out that this URL is an API URL that you can call with a GET request, and that's going to give you the exact same metadata object. So what I can do is, if I query all the IDs of all the flexi pages in my org, I can then create this URL, and then I can use the composite request of the tooling API to issue multiple requests in one go. So this composite request allows you to pass URLs from the Salesforce API itself, and you can have up to 25 sub requests in a single call. So that means if I have 100 URLs, then I can just put them in batches of 25, and I just need to issue 5 calls to the Salesforce API. So that's what I did here. So essentially, the first thing I do is I said, okay, get me the IDs of all the flexi pages that are in the same object that the field belongs to, right? So the field belongs to the account object, and that object is represented by the entity definition ID, which is another field that I had to get from the field earlier. Once I have that, just make it a little bit bigger. And once I have that, I create a query and I pass it to the tooling API. And once I have the results, I create this list of objects which only has the type, flexi page, and the record ID. Then what I do is I have this custom API call that I created called read metadata, and I pass the flexi pages. And basically what this does is what I just said. It creates a URL for each of these items that I pass in the metadata, and it creates a request object with the method get, then the URL, the specific URL to that object. And then because I know that the limit of URLs per request is 25, then I split that in batches of 25, which means that if I had 100 flexi pages, then I'm going to end up with 5 batches of 25 each. And then all I have to do is I go through this and I create a composite request body. And then finally, I use promise at all to put everything in one single request and send it over to Salesforce. So it's a really good way to send or to get the metadata of multiple metadata objects in essentially just one go. So once I have the results from promise.all, then I return it to the caller. And then here I just do some hard coding where I go through all the flexi pages, and then I go to the flexi page regions. Then I go through the instances and I check, okay, if it has a visibility rule and if it has a criteria, then I go through each criteria. And if the criteria left value equals the field, then I say, okay, this flexi page is using the field. But again, it's not enough to know that flex page is using the field. I want to tell you exactly how it is being used. So then I create this pill here, which is going to tell you that the filter is the operator and the criteria is the right value, which is what we saw here in the JSON of the flex page. So that's how you do that. Another thing here is, for example, we looked at how do you know if an Apex class is reading from a field or if it's writing? Now this one is a little hacky. I'm sure some of you will cringe when you see how I did this. But essentially I have this get field info for Apex class. So basically what I do here is I get the API name of the field. In this case, like field name __ C. And then I create a regular expression which is going to match that field name equals something, except equals, because that's a Boolean operation, not an actual assignment. So then I create that regular expression, then I query the body of all the Apex classes that the metadata component dependency told me that are being used. But again, remember, I don't know how they are using the field. So I take the body out of that. Then I go through all the Apex classes. I remove any comments from the body because obviously I don't want to have a match on a comment and falsely tell the user that, oh, it's being used in this way if it's just in some block of comments. So I remove all the comments. I remove all the spaces. And then finally what I do is I say, okay, I know that the class is using the field. So at a minimum, it's using it for reading. So I assume that the default scenario is that it's being used for reading and that the other scenarios that it's being used for writing. So if the body of the Apex classes matches the regular expression where it says field equals something, then I say, okay, this class is writing into the field. If it doesn't match that, then I will go to the default, which is that is being used for reading. There's also a sort order because I want to show the ones that write first, because those are the ones that could be more important if you are debugging what's going on with that field. So that's basically it. There's a few more things I could show, but I think I'm going to move forward. Before I go to the slides, so this API, as I said, it's been there in beta for 4 years. It took me around maybe 2 years to create this product. Not 2 years to go live. It maybe took 10 months for the first version, which was very, very different from what you see right now. And then I've just been working on it with different users, different people, implementing new features and requirements. It's been, I think, over 2 years now. And in that time, the API slowly started to lose some features. Like before, we could actually see where what reports were using that field. And one of my favorite features of HappySoup was that I had some custom code to again show you how the report was using that field. Was it in a filter in that report? Was it a grouping, or was it just a column? Because again, if you're removing or renaming a fixed value, you are suddenly invalidating that filter from the report, and you just would never know. That was one of my favorite features, and then suddenly the report metadata type just went away from the result set. And because the API is in beta, then there was really nothing you can do about it, right? Because they're still testing it and making changes. And so I started to notice that it slowly started to have less support. And so we started to try to ask Salesforce, okay, when is this API going to be generally available? And that takes me to the next section. So it took a long time to get an update from Salesforce. And by the way, this is not a critique on Salesforce. I'm just telling the actual story of what happened. So this person, Marcio, made a comment on the Dependency API chatter group asking if when the API is coming along or when it's going to be GA. So I started this sort of GA please movement, which means generally available, please. And I went all over social media and I asked all my connections to please go on this chatter post and just use the hashtag GA please, just to put a little bit of pressure on Salesforce to give an update on this. I think we got like, well, you can see it there, 67 answers. So a lot of people came forward to support the GA Please movement, which I was very happy with. Fortunately, maybe 2 months later, Salesforce came with this announcement, which I'm going to read out loud. So we've realized that the Dependency API in its current beta form is not built on a foundation solid and robust enough to declare it GA. New foundations were laid to support a where is its use feature and want to leverage this in a new Dependency API, but questions remain. As we head into the new calendar year, we will be putting together a plan for removing the current beta from public access. Ouch. At the same time, we will be working with you, the community, on the right path forward, what the right path forward is for this API feature. So it's very unfortunate. Obviously, I get it. If it wasn't built on a solid foundation, then it's not something that can scale. But and it's obviously not a personal thing, but it hurts, right? Because you've been working on this thing for 2 years, weekends, neglecting your wife, kids, and just coding there, and it becomes really like your baby, right? You have this product that you're really working on, and then unfortunately this announcement was made. So what is the future for Happy Soup now is it's still available on borrowed time. I don't know when the API is going to go away. I assume it's going to be sometime later this year. As long as it's there, Happy Soup will remain. I'm trying to focus on solving other problems worth solving because I have already all the infrastructure. I have the web app, I have the API wrappers and all that stuff. So I'm thinking of other problems that I could solve, and I'm saying worth solving because I know there's a lot of stuff that you can do with the Salesforce API. But I wouldn't want Happy Soup to become another generic app that does some solves some small problems. So one of the problems that I decided to resolve is I created a new workflow export for flow migration. So workflows are being deprecated in a couple of years, and you need to move everything to flows, and it's not clear how to do that, right? Like I think everyone agrees that if you have 100 workflows, you shouldn't just create 100 flows. You should do something to understand which workflows are similar and which ones you can combine it into a same flow. So I created a new feature which does not depend on the API at all. I made sure to only use GA APIs this time. It's very simple. You just go here to workflow migration info. You select standard or custom object, and then you select the object that you want to export the workflows from. So in this case, let's say the account object. Now, it would be pretty useless if I just gave you an export of the workflows just like that. So what I do is I aggregate a lot of information from these workflows and I give it to you in a CSV, and you end up with something like this. So what we're seeing here is all the workflows that are being used in the account object, and I can see if they're active, I can see the type, I can see the criteria, I can see if it has field updates, does it have email alerts, does it have tabs, what about outbound messages, and then does it have time-based actions. Then I also tell you which fields are being used in the criteria, which fields are being used in the action. So like if it's a field update, what are the fields that are being updated? Also, what are the email templates that are being used by these workflows? And then what are the emails that we're sending emails to? So this is really nice because if you create some nice filters here, you can do pretty much whatever you want. You can say, I want to see all the workflows that have field updates and that also send email alerts, right, to this email address, for example. So it's really useful to be able to do some analysis on your workflows, understand if there are any similarities, and then decide which ones you want to combine into a flow. But that's essentially it. I think that the key takeaway here is don't spend 2 years working on an API that hasn't been made generally available. The other day, somebody pinged me on LinkedIn saying that, hey, there's a new Salesforce API in beta, and I'm like, I don't want to know. I'll wait. I'll let someone else do the 2 years work. But anyway, so I hope you guys learned something, and I think we still have 10 minutes if there are any questions. Thank you very much. Any questions? No, so the question is if you can find dynamic references in Apex. No. So for example, I think what you're saying is if the field is being used in like a custom metadata type, then the field name is not hard-coded in your Apex class, so you wouldn't know that it's there because it's just being used in a custom metadata type. No, but one thing I did implement in HappySoup is I had this option here for fielding metadata types. This feature was actually requested by Dan over there. So what you can do with this is you can see if the field is being used in a metadata type in the field. There's a special field in the metadata type called field definition or something like that. Yeah, so at least I can show you that, so I can tell you if the field is being used in custom metadata types and also the object, but no, it doesn't support dynamic references. One thing about dynamic references is that I can also, if we go here for email templates to see, okay, where are email templates being used, I may not remember the name, so let me see if I can show the example here. So let's say I want to see where this email template is being used. Oh, bug. Okay, hold on, let me try that again. Nice, okay. So one of the things I did in HappySoup is I knew that you could use email templates in a dynamic way. Like what if you have the email template API name on a custom label, and then you're just using that custom label in Apex to say, send this email template. Then you would never find that that template is being used in Apex because the name of the template is nowhere to be found in your Apex class. So what I did in HappySoup is I manually searched for custom labels that match on the template name, the API name, the ID, or the label, which means that if you're using an email template in any way, or at least any way that makes sense in custom labels, we'll find it, right? So here in this template is using the ID, this custom label is using the ID of the email template. This one is using the API name. And another thing I tell you is I also tell you, hey, this class is making a query to the email template object. So I don't know if that class is using that email template. All I'm telling you is that that class is making a query to the email template object. So maybe that template is being used by that class. So I think that's what I have for dynamic references. Any other questions? No. Good call. Yeah. So the question is on Apex classes, if you're doing account.put and then the field name, do I catch that as being written? No, I actually never thought about that. So good. Thanks for that. No, but you have the API, so really it's a really simple API. You just create a what I call an entry point, which is the name, then the type and the ID. In this case, it's standard field, so there's no ID. You instantiate the SFDC soup library, and then you just say, I want the usage or the get dependencies. So really, anyone can wrap this into an SFDX plugin. I've never done it because I just haven't had the time to look into how to create plugins. But I know there's an open source project from Accenture called I forgot what his name. What I think SF PowerKit or something like that, and they use this API internally to parse some dependencies. The API or Happy Soup or both? It's like no. Yeah, I should have just said no. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yes, yeah. For things like that, you may just, as you said, just take that metadata, put it in Visual Studio Code, and just search for it. Okay. Oh yeah. Right. Yeah. You're right. Cool. Yeah. So I think for now, again, Happy Soup will still be there as long as the API is available. The ability to export workflows does not depend on the API at all. So if you like that, I would highly recommend that you use it. I think I don't know of any other app that allows you to get this detail of level into your workflows. So I'm not saying it's perfect, but if you use it, then you can tell me what's missing, and I can add that in there. So any more questions? We have 2 more minutes. No? I guess a lot of stuff. I learned a lot of technical stuff that I had no idea. Like all the stuff about, for example, using the Composite Request. When I learned about this API or this ability to do Composite Request, I never understood why you would use this. It was like an abstract thing that, okay, you can do that, but I never had a real use case. So I learned a lot of stuff about how to use multiple APIs and create this Frankenstein app that uses a lot of different things, and then you can show some really nice information to the user. Also learn a lot about JavaScript. I love JavaScript. I feel like when I'm coding in JavaScript, I feel like I'm flying as compared to Apex. I really like that I can just code stuff without worrying about types. And I had a conversation about that with someone yesterday, but they were like, but how do you know if it's a Boolean or if it's a string? And I was like, well, if you don't know if your own code is a Boolean or a string, then you have a different problem, right? So I learned a lot about JavaScript, and I really enjoyed programming on it. I also learned how to create Node.js packages and quickly package small applications. So now if I have an idea of a quick app, I know how to just create something very quickly. And I got a lot of networking. I met so many people thanks to Happy Soup. Made a lot of friends, a lot of good connections. So if you're thinking of creating some sort of app or some project, I highly recommend it. It's one of the best things I've done for my career. It actually gave me the job that I have right now, which is a different story, but it literally changed my life. So I highly recommend, if you're interested, to spend some time in some side project. All right. Thank you very much, everyone.